You know how they say the scariest things in life aren't the monsters under the bed or the ghosts in the attic? The truth is far more terrifying, because sometimes the real horror comes from moments you never see coming. Things that could happen to any one of us, at any time. Tonight, I'm going to share with you stories that aren't about the supernatural, but about real-life events, situations that started out completely normal, until they became nightmares. Story 1. The Stranger in the Alley. It was a regular Thursday night, just like any other. I was walking home from a friend's place after a late dinner. It wasn't even that late, maybe 9 or 10 p.m. The neighborhood I lived in was usually pretty quiet, a suburban area with narrow, dimly lit streets. I'd walked this route countless times, but something about that night was different. I could feel it. I decided to take a shortcut through an alley I had never really used before. It wasn't the smartest decision, but I was tired and just wanted to get home faster. The alley was long, narrow, and lined with tall brick walls. There were no windows, no doors, just that long stretch of emptiness. As soon as I stepped in, a chill ran down my spine. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, but I brushed it off as nerves and kept walking. About halfway through, I heard footsteps behind me. Not hurried, but deliberate, like someone was matching my pace. My heart started racing. I told myself it was just someone else taking the same shortcut. But the thing is, I hadn't seen anyone else when I entered the alley. I picked up my pace, trying not to look over my shoulder, but those footsteps mirrored mine, each step syncing perfectly with mine. I finally glanced back and saw him. A man, maybe mid-30s, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by shadows. He wasn't walking fast or trying to hide, but his presence alone was unsettling. I kept walking faster, and he did the same. At that point, every instinct in me screamed to run, but the alley was so narrow that running didn't feel like an option. Plus, if I ran, what would that tell him? That I was scared? That I was an easy target? As I neared the end of the alley, I could feel him getting closer. I started mentally preparing myself for a confrontation, for the worst. I gripped my keys between my fingers like some kind of pathetic weapon, but I wasn't sure if it would even help. Then I heard him speak, just a single word. Stop. It wasn't a request. It was a command, low and menacing. I froze, every muscle in my body tightening. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to figure out what he wanted. My phone? My wallet? But no, it wasn't about that. It was something worse. Before I could do anything, he grabbed my arm, his grip tight and unforgiving. My heart pounded in my ears as I tried to pull away. But he was strong, stronger than I'd expected. He didn't say anything else, just yanked me toward him. In that moment, all I could think was that this was it. This was how I was going to die, in a dirty alley with no one around to hear me scream. I don't know how, but I managed to twist my arm just enough to break free. I stumbled backward, not thinking, just running. I didn't even care that I was running blindly into traffic when I burst out of that alley, barely missing a car that honked loudly as I darted across the street. I heard him shout behind me, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran all the way home, not stopping until I was behind my locked door, gasping for breath. My hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't even dial 911. When I finally calmed down enough to call the police, they found no trace of him. No cameras, no witnesses, nothing. But I knew what happened. I felt it. And to this day, I don't take shortcuts. Not ever again. Story 2. The Man at the Door. It was a sweltering summer night, the kind where the heat seeps into every corner of the house, making it impossible to sleep. I lived alone back then, in a small, run-down apartment just outside the city. The kind of place where you know your neighbors, but you don't really talk to them. You keep to yourself. It was around midnight when I heard the knock. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, sweating through my sheets, when the sound cut through the stillness. 3 sharp knocks. My stomach dropped. I wasn't expecting anyone, and who knocks on doors at that hour? I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was a mistake. But then the knocks came again, more insistent this time. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. I slowly got up, my heart already pounding in my chest. Every step toward the door felt heavier than the last. When I reached the peephole, I hesitated. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me to. Through the fisheye lens, I saw a man. He was standing there, facing the door, his head tilted slightly downward so I couldn't see his face clearly. He was dressed casually, jeans, a t-shirt, but there was something off about him. He wasn't moving, just standing there waiting. I didn't say anything. I didn't open the door. I just stood there, my hand hovering over the lock, frozen in place. I thought about calling the police, but I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? A man knocked on my door? They wouldn't take me seriously. Then, as if reading my mind, the man spoke. His voice was calm, almost pleasant. "I know you're in there." My heart stopped. How did he know? Was he watching me somehow? I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I didn't make a sound, didn't breathe, but he continued. "I just need to talk to you. Please open the door." There was no way I was opening that door. I retreated to my bedroom, locking myself in, my phone clutched in my hand. I called 911, whispering into the phone, trying not to make any noise that might alert him. The operator told me to stay on the line and that officers were on their way. It felt like an eternity, every second stretching out painfully as I waited, praying he wouldn't try to break in. Suddenly, I heard the sound of the doorknob rattling, then the unmistakable click of it turning. He was trying to get in. My heart was in my throat as I listened, terrified that the flimsy lock would give way. I held my breath, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. No more rattling, no more knocks. Silence. I waited listening, my body trembling with fear. The police arrived a few minutes later, but when they checked the hallway, the man was gone. They told me it was probably just a guy who had the wrong apartment, but I knew better. There was something about him, something in the way he stood there, in the way he spoke, that told me he wasn't just some lost stranger. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. I kept the lights on, kept checking the locks, jumping at every little sound. And every time I pass a door, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for another chance. Story 3. The Parking Lot Encounter. I just finished a long shift at work, and it was nearly midnight by the time I clocked out. My office was in a quiet, industrial part of town. The parking lot was huge and nearly empty at that hour, with only a few scattered cars under the dim glow of the flickering streetlights. I had parked farther away from the building than usual that morning, and as I started walking toward my car, I felt an odd sense of unease. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the eerie silence that had settled over the lot. But the further I walked, the stronger the feeling got. It wasn't just the stillness or the dark shadows cast by the parked cars. No, this was different, a growing awareness that I wasn't alone. I picked up my pace, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have. As I approached my car, I instinctively glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw him, a man standing at the edge of the lot, just barely visible in the shadow of a streetlight. He wasn't moving, just watching me. I quickened my steps, my heartbeat matching the pace of my feet. My car was still several rows away, and the closer I got, the more I realized he was moving too. He was walking now, but slowly, deliberately, as if he didn't want to scare me, at least not yet. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just some guy passing through, but every instinct screamed that wasn't the case. I gripped my car keys tighter, fumbling for the remote to unlock the doors. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped them. By the time I reached my car, he was much closer, moving faster now. I could hear his footsteps behind me, growing louder with every second. I managed to unlock the door and threw myself inside, slamming it shut just as he reached the rear of my car. My fingers scrambled to lock the doors. My breath was coming in sharp, panicked gasps as I finally managed to engage the lock. He was standing right outside, no more than a few feet away, his face half lit by the dim glow of the parking lot light. He didn't look at the door or the car. He looked directly at me, through the glass, his expression calm, like this was just another ordinary night for him. I remember staring back, frozen in terror, as he raised his hand and knocked on the window, 3 soft, measured taps. I could hear the sound clearly, like he was taking his time, enjoying the moment. My instincts kicked in, and I slammed the car into reverse, nearly hitting another vehicle as I backed out of the space. My eyes were fixed on him the entire time, and I could see the small smirk creeping onto his face. He didn't chase me, didn't run after the car. He just stood there, watching me as I sped away. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway, my hands still trembling as I clutched the steering wheel. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. And to this day, every time I walk to my car in a dark parking lot, I can still feel that same cold, unnerving gaze, watching me from the shadows. Story 4. The Man in the Window. It was my first night house-sitting for a friend of mine who had gone on vacation for a week. Their house was in a quiet, rural area, one of those places where the nearest neighbor is half a mile away, and the only sound at night is the wind rustling through the trees. I thought it would be peaceful, even relaxing. I couldn't have been more wrong. The house was beautiful, 2 stories with large windows overlooking a vast backyard that stretched out into a thick forest. By the time I settled in, it was already dark, and the house felt almost too quiet. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and finally sat down to watch some TV, trying to ignore the unease building in my chest. At around 11 p.m., I decided to call it a night. As I stood up to turn off the lights, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Movement just outside the large sliding glass door that led to the back porch. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I stared at the door, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the reflection of the living room lights in the glass. I laughed nervously to myself, blaming it on exhaustion and maybe a bit of paranoia. But as I turned to head upstairs, I heard it, a faint creak from outside, like someone stepping on the wooden porch. The sound was unmistakable, and every hair on the back of my neck stood up. I moved slowly, cautiously, toward the glass door, peeking through the curtains. My heart was racing, but there was no one. The porch was empty, the yard dark and still. I tried to shake the feeling that something was off, but it clung to me like a shadow. I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, my body tense with unease. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it again, a light tapping sound, this time from one of the windows in the master bedroom. My pulse quickened. I didn't want to look. Every fiber of my being told me not to look. But I had to. The bedroom window faced the backyard, and as I slowly approached it, I could see the silhouette of a man standing just beyond the glass. My blood ran cold. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring directly into the window. His face was obscured by the darkness, but his figure was unmistakable. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands, but as soon as I looked back at the window, he was gone. Vanished. The police arrived within minutes, but there was no trace of anyone around the property. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. Nothing. They told me it was probably just a trick of the light or an animal in the yard, but I knew what I saw. I didn't sleep that night, and I never stayed in that house again. Story 5. The Highway Incident. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. I had planned to drive through the night to visit family in another state, and the highway was mostly empty, save for the occasional truck or distant headlights. The stretch of road I was on was particularly isolated, just miles of open desert on either side, the kind of place where help would take a long time to arrive if something went wrong. I'd been driving for a few hours, my mind starting to drift as the monotonous sound of the tires rolling over the pavement lulled me into a kind of daze. That's when I saw it. Far ahead, in the distance, there was a car pulled off to the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing weakly in the darkness. As I got closer, I could make out the figure of a man standing next to the car, waving his arms. I slowed down, my headlights illuminating his face. He looked panicked, desperate, like he needed help. His car seemed to have broken down, and he was gesturing frantically for me to pull over. I hesitated. It was late, and I was alone on a desolate highway. Every instinct told me to keep driving, but there was a part of me that felt guilty. What if he really needed help? What if I was the only car that would pass by for hours? Against my better judgment, I slowed to a stop a few feet ahead of his car. I kept my engine running and my doors locked as I rolled down the window, just enough to hear him. "Please," he said, his voice shaky. "My car won't start. Can you give me a ride to the next gas station?" Something about him felt off. Maybe it was the way his eyes darted around nervously, or the fact that his car didn't seem to have any obvious damage. I glanced at his vehicle, and that's when I noticed it. The passenger door was slightly ajar, just enough to see movement inside. A second person. My blood ran cold. I couldn't see who it was, but there was definitely someone else in that car, crouched down low, trying to stay out of sight. My heart pounded as I slowly shifted the car into gear. The man was still standing there, his eyes wide and pleading, but I wasn't falling for it. I mumbled something about not being able to help, rolled up the window, and hit the gas. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was no longer waving. He was standing perfectly still, watching me drive off, his figure shrinking into the distance. And then I saw it. The passenger door of his car swung open, and a second person stepped out. I drove for miles before I finally stopped to collect myself, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I never found out what they were planning or who they were, but I knew one thing for sure. If I had stopped, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. What makes these stories so terrifying isn't that they're improbable, but that they could happen to any one of us. A walk through a parking lot, a knock at the door, or a late-night drive. Ordinary moments, until they suddenly aren't. It's the unpredictability, the fragility of safety, that reminds us how close we always are to danger. So the next time you find yourself alone, walking to your car, answering a door, or helping a stranger, take a moment to think. Trust your instincts, because the scariest thing about real life, you never know when it'll take a turn toward the unthinkable.